Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in. We are going to get started and get right into it. My name is Chris Garaffa. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Covert Action Bulletin podcast, the official radio show and podcast of Covert Action Magazine. You can hear us on WBAI in New York City, Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Or 9 a.m., I'm sorry. And you can get us in your favorite podcast player whenever you want every week. We're really excited for tonight's webinar, and we really appreciate you all joining us. You know, we're well over 100 days into the latest Israeli siege on Gaza, with millions of people across the world having sprung into action to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people. At least 70 cities, from Atlanta to Seattle and Chicago to Bridgeport, Connecticut, have passed ceasefire resolutions, and international days of action have brought countless demonstrations, shutdowns, and more, threatening business as usual. And people are questioning why it is that the US relies so heavily on Israel to do its bidding in the Middle East, to the point of funding genocide to the tune of $4 billion a year, with many more billions extra available basically on request. We have to stop funding this war machine. Tonight, we do have a really exciting lineup of speakers. We're having a little technical trouble with some of our guests, but we do have a really fantastic program to go through tonight. So before we get into it, and we're going to be exposing, the dynamics behind Israel's aggression and the role of the United States. But before we get into it, I want to ask everyone, if you appreciate Covert Action Magazine and the content that we bring you, please take a moment to go to our website and make a donation. We are completely reliant on the funding from our readers and our supporters to keep this work going. And we'll drop a link in the chat too, but it's covertactionmagazine.com/donate. So I want to get right into this. I want to introduce our guest, Matthew Ho. He's a former U.S. Marine Corps captain, an Iraq veteran, an Afghanistan State Department officer, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. And he's going to talk about the terrible human cost of the war and the threat that the conflict holds for unleashing a world war using Israel as a proxy. So please join me in welcoming Matthew. Pin you.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Hear me okay?
You're great.
Okay, great. Terrific. I was just doing some last second math there for something I want to talk about earlier. So I appreciate you having me here tonight. Thank you for everyone for tuning in and watching this. And of course, thank you for your ongoing concern for and solidarity with the Palestinian people, as well as your ongoing efforts to oppose the American empire. I was asked to speak about the costs of this genocide that is occurring, as well as to tie it in a bit to American complicity with it. And then also there's a third thing, if we have time, I'll get into that as well, how this transforms into a larger war. And certainly we are seeing that at play as we see, this war not only confined to Gaza, but certainly to the people of the West Bank, to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iraq, to Yemen. So this idea that this is a wider war or could be a wider war is something that's already occurring, and it already exists. And we'll speak about that a bit and hopefully get to some questions, and hopefully my colleagues on the panel are able to join us. But, with regards to the genocide, if people want to have the best summation of why this is a genocide, there is no better argument than that which South Africa put forward in the International Court of Justice. It's about 85 pages long. If you have people in your life who do not agree with that term, genocide, provide them with that document, provide them with South Africa's argument that this is genocide. It is at 85 pages, not succinct, but it is compelling, and it is authoritative. And I know many people whose minds have been changed about the usage of the term genocide by that argument made by South Africa. But as we are here tonight, according to the health ministry in Gaza, 4.5% of the Gazan population has been killed, wounded, or are missing since October 7th. 4.5% of the population. I mean, that is just simply astounding. The equivalent numbers for the Americans, if you were to do that here, you're talking about tens and tens of millions of people killed, wounded, or made missing by a foreign power. The costs are it's dramatic, particularly when you're able to make points of comparison. But just as of today, again from the Gaza Health Ministry, and we know these numbers are conservative, but as of today, the Gaza Health Ministry reports 27,478 people have been killed. More than 66,835 are missing. I'm sorry, 66,835 are wounded. More than 8,000 are missing. Among those numbers, you have 11,500 children that are killed. To make a comparison, the United Nations reports that Russia, in its 2-year long war in Ukraine, has killed less than 600 children. So we've seen the Israelis in less than 4 months kill 11,500 children. At least 11,500 children, while the Russians have killed less than 600 in 2 years. The numbers are conservative. We know this because you can look at the history of warfare, understanding that oftentimes our understanding of casualty counts only comes at a later time. You can look at the videos from Gaza. You can look at the destruction that is occurring. You could look at the tonnage of bombs released. More than the Hiroshima bomb has been released in terms of explosive weight against the people of Gaza. And you could just conclude that there has to be more dead, that there have to be more wounded. And of course, those more than 8,000 that are missing, again, looking at the videos of the destroyed building, knowing that the Palestinians have no ability to rescue these people other than by using their hands, we know that only a handful of those who are officially missing will be found alive, will be rescued. We also know that the Israelis are deliberately targeting medical infrastructure as well as the communications infrastructure. There's many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is to ensure that reporting does not occur. We know that these numbers are correct and accurate. We know this because Israeli media has reported that these are the numbers that the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli intelligence agencies use. They use the Gazan Health Ministry numbers. We know from back in October, because Yahoo News in the United States told us that the State Department uses these numbers. We know that the United Nations and human rights organizations use these numbers. You could suppose that NATO, armed forces, intelligence service, governments utilize these numbers as well. So we know that these numbers are accurate, and by any means, they are an undercount. And so one of the purposes in that direct assault on the medical and communications infrastructure of Gaza is to prevent this type of information from being assembled and being reported. It's also one of the reasons why Israel's scared to death that Western journalists are going to get into Gaza and be able to report. I mean, the Palestinians who have been reporting they are heroes for their heroism in their journalism is unparalleled. But unfortunately, we live in a culture that discounts them. And the Israelis know this. And so they know that Western audiences will receive information from a Western journalist differently than they will from a Palestinian journalist. I mean, that's gross, and it's awful, but that's the reality of it. So this is why the Israelis work so hard to either prevent the information being collected and disseminated, and if it is, to belittle it and try and try and claim it is not valid. Just as one last number on the physical costs here, just in the last 24 hours, you've had 113 Palestinians killed and 205 injured, and those numbers are daily like that. The deaths running into the hundreds, the wounded running into the high hundreds, into the thousands. And this has been going on for 122 days now. We see the displacement. 85% of Palestinians are displaced. So out of a population of 2.2 million, you're looking at roughly about 2 million people being displaced. At this point, a majority of them are located in the southernmost city of Rafah. Estimates are 1.6 million people may be in Rafah right now. And if you've been following this, Rafah is the next target of attack for the Palestinians. These people have nowhere to go. So the idea that somehow we will not see an increase in the casualties is just makes, it has to occur. If the Israelis push into Rafah, these casualty numbers will only climb. And of course, we are now seeing reports, and have been for months now, of the indirect effects of war, if you can call them that, but the effects of disease, illness, the weather, starvation. There are reports of people freezing to death. Chris and I were just talking about that before we started this program. If you tune into Democracy Now! From this morning, you will see an interview with a Palestinian American gentleman whose family he recounts all the family he has killed in Gaza, and one of them was a 20-year-old who has frozen to death. People think it's not possible in the Middle East to freeze to death. Well, it doesn't really have to get that cold. You're talking about maybe into the 40s, particularly when you have wet weather, for hypothermia to be induced, right? So, I mean, the casualties are only going to climb. These numbers that we have are conservative. This idea that somehow it's going to stop at only 4.5% of the population being killed, wounded, or made missing. I'm really afraid at what we are going to see in terms of a month's, 2 months, 6 months from now, what the casualty numbers will reflect, particularly as disease and starvation and exposure take hold. The idea of genocide, though, isn't just about killing the people, right? Certainly, ethnic cleansing can be a component to genocide, so driving them off their land. But, one of the things is to make the land uninhabitable. And you've seen that with the Israeli campaign, again, a deliberate campaign. So as of today, according to Al Jazeera, you've seen 360,000 residential units destroyed in Gaza. So 360,000 homes have been destroyed in Gaza. Prior to this genocide beginning, there were only 439,000 homes in Gaza. So if you're looking at these numbers, you do the math, and 82% of homes, of residential units in Gaza, have been destroyed in the last 4 months. I mean, it's unfathomable, those numbers. I mean, but that is part of the plan. That is a deliberate process to make the land, to make the environment uninhabitable. And you start by displacing people and making it so that they cannot go back home, even they want to, because you have destroyed their homes. And certainly, I think people have probably seen the reporting on this, whether it's the Israeli army blowing up buildings, for a variety of with a variety of excuses and rationales, which our State Department, of course, either backs them on or pretends they don't have the knowledge to make a judgment on. Or we have seen even things where individual soldiers, individual units of the Israeli army burning homes down. Haaretz had a story on this last week, how the burning of Gazan homes has become routine. It is part of the policy. So whether they destroy them by bombing them, whether they destroy them by shelling them, whether they plant explosives and blow them up, or whether they burn them to the ground, they are making the land immediately uninhabitable by destroying these people's homes. You see it in terms of destroying the infrastructure. So we have seen more than half of Gazan schools destroyed. Uh, you're talking about there's an ancillary aspect of this because many of those schools are also utilized as shelters for the people. Just to get on a tangent, that at the beginning of this 4 months ago, people will recall that how come there's no bomb shelters? Well, there are bomb shelters. There are places that are recognized by international law as safe zones for civilians. They are clearly marked. They are clearly identified ahead of time to the Israelis. Many of them are schools, and they are attacked relentlessly and deliberately. And so this idea about what about the bomb shelters? Well, we can see what's happening to the bomb shelters. They're blowing them up. They would have done the same if they put them underground. It doesn't really matter because this is part of the Israeli plan, is to make the land uninhabitable. And one of the things you do is by taking away a people's ability to function, to live, to thrive. And to do that, you destroy their education system. So as we said, we've seen more than half of the schools in Gaza destroyed. We have seen all of the universities in Gaza destroyed. All, off the top of my head, I can't remember, 12 or 14, I can't remember which number it is. All of the universities in Gaza have been destroyed. Again, very deliberate. It's planned. It's part of making, as genocide, part of making the land, the environment, the area uninhabitable. We've seen 221 places of worship have been destroyed, and reports are that there is not one church or mosque left standing in North Gaza. So you take away people's who they are. And this gets into another aspect of genocide of that I'll get to in a moment. But this phase, you're making it uninhabitable. There's nothing there. You're taking away their infrastructure. You're taking away their sense of place, their sense of belonging, and you do that by destroying their community. Of course, another aspect of this is by destroying their medical infrastructure. And we know that out of 35 hospitals that were fully functioning on October 7th, only 13 are partially functioning. And I think you probably are stretching that term partially to include a lot of hospitals that anywhere else in the world would be considered inoperable. That would not be functioning at all. I mean, certainly you've seen the number of healthcare professionals who have been killed, whether they be doctors, nurses, staff, ambulance drivers. The number of ambulances that have been destroyed have been in the hundreds. They have been deliberately targeted, just as the healthcare facilities have been deliberately targeted. You destroy the water, you destroy the land. And so you see this by attacking the infrastructure, say the water infrastructure. You see the Israelis, they will bring their vehicles in, and they do this in the West Bank as well. They will dig up the streets, makes the roads, of course, impassable, unusable. But what it also does is you're tearing apart the water infrastructure, whether it be the freshwater lines or the sewage lines. So if you cannot get water, as well as you're exposed to open sewage, the land is uninhabitable. What they have gone even a step further is by attacking the tunnel systems, the Hamas tunnel systems in Gaza. They have pumped seawater into these tunnels. It is an attempt to either drown or flush out Hamas fighters. It doesn't seem to be working at all, but it also has a secondary effect, and maybe that's the primary effect, of ruining the land. So whether it's agricultural land, which is also being destroyed by the Israelis driving their vehicles through it and using chemical means to destroy the land, but also, too, they are flooding these tunnels with this seawater, which, as it drains out of the tunnels, because the tunnels are porous, it destroys the land. That salt water makes the land unable to be used for agriculture, but also, too, it destroys the water table. So whether that water is going to be used to drink or whether it's going to be used to irrigate the land, it's unusable because it's now contaminated with salt water. So again, another way you make the land uninhabitable. Excuse me. The assaults on the land and the assaults on the infrastructure and the assaults on the people are meant, of course, to drive the people away, to kill them, as well as to cleanse the land of them. But there's also another phase of this too, in terms of how the genocide works, wherein You attack the idea of the people. You make it so that these people do not exist, not just literally, but figuratively. And you take away their history, you take away their sense of place, their sense of being. And you've seen the Israelis, just as they have deliberately killed civilians, just as they deliberately killed children, they just as they have destroyed the land, the water, the infrastructure, they have destroyed the idea of being Palestinian, or they're attempting to destroy the idea of being Palestinian. As many as you know, Palestinians have they are steadfast. Samud is what they call it, and this is what you will hear Palestinians say very often. They're, and that they'll cite their steadfastness. But the idea, though, behind this other aspect of genocide is to destroy the identity of the people. And you do that. You see them killing poets. You see them, the Israelis killing poets. You see the Israelis killing artists. You see the Israelis killing singers. You see the Israelis who are killing people. They are targeting directly those who give identity, who give a sense of self to the Palestinians, who tell the Palestinians who they are, what they are about, where they came from, and where they can go. And of course, killing the children is a huge part of destroying where you can go as a people, because you are literally killing the future. You see the Israelis destroying statues and monuments. You see them destroying the museums and sacking the museums, taking away the Palestinians' antiquities, looting basically. But there's a more insidious, nefarious aspect of that looting, because it's not just meant for enrichment. It's meant to destroy the people, their identity, their history, who they are, where they came from. And of course, you see this most especially in the cemeteries. You've seen the reporting on the widespread destruction of cemeteries, not just desecration, but destruction of cemeteries, so that you are literally uprooting the people from their land. You are making it so that the Palestinians cannot point to a piece of ground and say, that is us, that is us, that is our people who are in that land. So this is such a the manner of this is done in such a deliberate, planned execution as to make it as if you were writing a story or scripting a movie, because it is so perfect, it is so deliberate, it is so well planned and choreographed, and there is an idea, there is a method. This is madness in its evil. It's madness in its inhumanity, but it's certainly not mad in its execution at all. And there's one aspect about this, and then I'll move on to another aspect, is the psychological aspect. And this, of course, plays into all three, right? Kill the people, make their land uninhabitable, destroy the idea of those people. And this is the psychological wounding that's occurring to the Palestinian people. The scale of the attacks, the fact that the entire population has been subjected, that there is no safe zone, that there is no escape, the mental health wounds, the consequences of this, not just for this generation, but for future generations, are immense. And we probably don't have a good idea of it, because we may not have seen anything like this in living history, of a people trapped, a people besieged and murdered on television, on our screens, on our phones, in front of us. What does that do psychologically to a people? I mean, certainly we understand the effects of warfare with post-traumatic stress disorder. You are going to see an incredible amount of traumatic brain injuries because of the concussive effects of all the bombs and missiles and shells being detonated, particularly in a built-up area. So those blast waves have nowhere to go. So you're going to have that type of effect in terms of the brain injuries on these people. You are going to have issues, of course, with depression and other associated mental health wounds. And it will carry on, and it will be a part of these people. And so we all understand at this point, there's no question about it. This is what the research and the literature tells us, that trauma is intergenerational. Trauma is passed down. So we have children who have not yet been born in Palestine, children who will not be born for generations, who will still bear the trauma of this genocide in the future. So the how all encompassing this is, how this genocide is just that. It is total. It is meant to destroy all aspects of the people, destroy their past, destroys their presence, destroys their future, destroys their lives, destroys their environment, it destroys their livelihoods, destroys their infrastructure, destroys who they were, their history, destroys their arts and their communities. I mean, so what we are looking at here is evil, and it's an evil that's only matched by the complicity of the American government. And, the American government is complicit in 5 ways, through military assistance, intelligence assistance, political assistance, diplomatic assistance, and media assistance. Um, Chris, I just want to make sure that the other guests haven't come on.
No, you're doing fantastic. So let's just keep going. I think, I've certainly got questions for you, but I think you're getting into a lot of really important stuff right now. So
Okay.
let's just keep
Okay.
going with that. I want to hear more about these
That's
5 points for sure.
sure. That's one of the horrible things about what I just spoke about. Uh, I was expecting 2 other panelists, so I cut that back quite a bit. Right. And so now here I am by myself, and I didn't even touch on maybe 10%, 20%, 30% of what's actually occurring there. I'm sure there are people who are watching, right, who can say, hey, Matt, you didn't talk about this aspect of the genocide. You left out this, because it's the idea of it is to destroy every last piece of the Palestinians. It is eradication. It is extermination. And, but to get these five points of how the Americans are complicit in all this, in the military, intelligence, political, diplomatic, and media. And the military is quite clear, whether it's the actual soldiers who are there, at least 1,000, the reports are, led by a 3-star American general, the American general, Marine Corps general, who was very involved in the United States war against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So he was very involved, of course, with the destruction of all those cities in eastern Syria, western Iraq, and northern Iraq. He has a team of about 1,000 people in Israel assisting the Israelis, providing advice and technical assistance. The really important thing about this, for people to understand, is what it means. If you have a 3-star general who is on the ground there, he can pick up the phone and call back to the Pentagon and say, I need this, and he will get it. And that's a lot quicker process than the Israelis having to make a formal request to the U.S. Embassy that we would like Reaper drone surveillance in this part of Gaza now, right? So it streamlines the process, and that's why those troops are there. Make sure things occur very quickly for the Israelis when they want them. You also have the equipment there. You have the drones that are there. The drones are not dropping bombs or firing missiles, but they have all their surveillance capabilities. This ties into the intelligence aspects of support for the Israeli genocide. In addition to all the drone support, you have the various aspects of American intelligence, signals support, or signals intelligence, satellite intelligence. Certainly, Gaza and is a priority for the American intelligence services now, and so a lot of resources that were pointed at another nation or another group are now being pointed at Gaza, and you could presume as well at the West Bank, most likely at Lebanon too, in terms of targeting Hezbollah, providing the information to Israel. One aspect of the military support, of course, is all the bombs being supplied, all the munitions being supplied, and it is massive. It is massive. The Israeli media last week reported that through January, 25,000 tons of munitions have been provided by the U.S. to Israel since October 7th. So it gives you, I mean, that is just a massive, massive amount. 25,000 tons is equivalent to 25 kilotons. For a point of comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. So the United States in the last 4 months have provided bombs with more than 1.5 times the explosive firepower of the Hiroshima bomb to the Israeli Defense Forces. We know that there are 2 or 3 American cargo planes landing every day in Israel. And we know that every third day, a cargo ship, an American cargo ship, shows up in an Israeli port and unloads these munitions. So the amount of supply is just massive. There is no way the Israelis could be conducting this genocide without the American assistance, most especially the amount of bombs being dropped, the amount of shells being fired, the amount of violence just being, put upon the Gazan people. That all comes from American supplied munitions, fired by American supplied weapons, or dropped from American supplied warplanes. You see with the political support, of course, most exemplified by the support in the United States Congress for Israel. Of course, this past weekend, we saw that Speaker Johnson is going to be putting forward a $17 billion funding bill for Israel. I don't see why that's not passed. The only reason it won't be passed is because there are political issues with the Senate regarding the border bill. But if that was not at play, I don't think anyone has any doubts that, with the exception of a few in the American Congress, that $17 billion will be approved in a quick and orderly manner. But that's the type of political support Israel has, and that support, of course, extends down to the state and local level. See here in North Carolina, where it was even last month, our state treasurer, Dale Folwell, who's running for governor, he's a Republican, made a big deal about enforcing North Carolina's prohibition of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Specifically, he made a big deal about how Ben and Jerry's will not be a vendor or or under contract at all with the North Carolina state government because of Ben and Jerry's stance on not selling their ice cream in illegal Israeli settlements. But I mean, so you see it at that level, but you even see it at levels where, say, here in North Carolina, where we've had an amazing turnout to get the Raleigh City Council to call for a ceasefire. And we have heard from council members that the fear of Israeli lobby money interfering in their local elections is very real. So even at the local level, you see the politics in all this. And of course, that political cover enables Israel to do what it's doing. You have the diplomatic complicity, very easy to see, of course, whether it be in UN Security Council resolutions calling for ceasefire. This goes back decades. You can even see in the non-binding UN General Assembly issue, the non-binding UN General Assembly resolutions, where the most recent one saying that Palestinians have a right to self-governance. All but 4 nations in the world voted for that. 2 of those were small Pacific Island nations that are beholden to the United States. And then the other 2, of course, were Israel and the United States. So you see that type of diplomatic cover, and that diplomatic cover is quite dangerous because what it turns into is the ability for the United States to stop funding for UNRWA. The ability of the United States to stop binding ceasefire resolutions, the ability of the United States to put in doubt the International Court of Justice. Does anyone have any doubts themselves that if the ICJ finds, and however long it takes, 6 months, a year, a couple of years, that Israel has committed genocide and orders Israel to do certain things in relation to that finding, that the United States will pull funding from the International Court of Justice, or that the United States will not sanction its members? People recall going back a couple of years when the International Criminal Court wanted to investigate U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, the United States threatened to sanction the court and its members. In the same thing too, the United States has made such declarations before to defend Israel, whether with the International Criminal Court. So this diplomatic cover is very, very important, because whether it's instances of international law, whether it's the ability of the United Nations to function, whether for its resolutions to be followed, or whether it's things for something like UNRWA to function itself, the United States is able to destroy that through its diplomatic through its diplomatic efforts, diplomatic malpractice, basically. And then finally, of course, the media support. The media support is massive. This to me, you get into what's the most important. I mean, certainly the military support, that 25,000 tons of explosives. Practically, if that's not available, Israel can't do that. So, that makes, obviously that's a paramount, paramount or prime consideration. But the media support is geared towards those who already support Israel. And I think that's the most important thing to understand about the media support. It's not meant for us. It's not meant for audiences outside Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Israel. It's meant to speak to those who are already on Israel's side. It's giving them a reason to continue on the side. It's emotionally manipulating them so that they are outraged, so that they see that there is a need for redemptive violence in Gaza. That is the only solution, is redemptive violence. That is the purpose of the media. And, there's a lot of great work being done right now. Chris McCreel at The Guardian just had an absolutely terrific article yesterday in The Guardian about how CNN is biased and complicit and basically working with the Israelis, as well too. If you look at the work done by Adam Johnson and Uthman Ali, one of those was in The Intercept, another was in Adam Johnson's Substack, The Column, just quantitatively going through how the American media talks about Israelis, how it talks about Palestinians, the incredibly important things to read, to understand, because that type of manipulation has such an impact. It has such an impact on not just the overall narrative, but ensuring that righteous anger, that indignation, that need for redemptive violence is being understood by the population that already supports Israel. And I'll say there are also similar studies have been done about the BBC and CBC's, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporations, their coverage as well. So I'll wrap it up there. I know that's quite a lot to resuscitate at you all. Most of you all probably knew that. And like I said, I probably left out a lot. But I also see that we've got one of the other panelists joining. So I will turn it back over to Chris.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthew. That was you know what? I think there's so many aspects to this situation that no one person can ever understand the whole thing. And I think that, people who study this, who are in these movements, who pay attention to this, I think everyone can learn something from all of these conversations. So really appreciate everything that you have said here. But we are very also excited, and we want to welcome Jeff Halper to the program. Jeff, thank you so much for being able to join us. We're gonna have you come up and speak next. And as a quick introduction for Jeff, Jeff is an Israeli-American anthropologist, an activist living in the West Bank since 1973. And, Jeff is going to uncover some of the powerful relations that make it possible for Israel to get away with this genocide. So I'm going to hand it right over now to Jeff Halper.
Well, thanks for having me. Just so you know, it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. So it just proves how much I value this invitation to speak to you all. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for being up so late, early. I don't even know which one it would which one it would be. Appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, it's 3 a.m. here, but all right. Well, and you can hear me okay, right? Everything's fine.
You sound great. Yeah, you sound great to me.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Well, how long do I have, by the way,
That's
to speak?
20 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, sitting here in Jerusalem, I'm kind of in the belly of the beast in terms of Israel, what we're doing to the Palestinians, and of course, relations to the United States. The United States is sort of the puppeteer in a lot of this. And one of the questions that I know we're asking in this webinar is, in a way, how does Israel get away with it? That's how I begin my book. I wrote a book called War Against the People: Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification, in which I tried to trace out what I was really trying to trace out, in a sense, was, well, it would trace out in a way, but I was trying to look at the global capitalist system and its enforcement. And in a sense, as the neoliberal system becomes more and more exclusive, more and more people are excluded from it. Not only the 85% of humanity in the global South that are considered surplus humanity, basically, that will never be educated, will never be brought into the capitalist system, will never become consumers, and so on, and therefore are excluded. More and more, the system, of course, is excluding people in the global North as well, especially the young generation. And as it becomes more exclusive, as we have these income disparities, as resources become scarcer and scarcer and flow to fewer and fewer people, and as the world begins to burn up, and of course you begin to have patterns of migration, and then you have issues of control and trying to exclude other people from the resources that you have, and you have concepts like Fortress Europe begin to develop, and so on. The whole capitalist system becomes more and more repressive. And I think until the mid-70s, 80s, when this neoliberal phase, this predatory phase of global capitalism really kicked in, capitalism was able to, it was growing still. There were new markets. The third world had just begun to emerge, out of colonialism. There were new markets, and capitalism could have a nicer face. Ronald McDonald and Disney movies and so on. But certainly in the last few decades, as it has become more repressive, as markets, in a sense, have been saturated already, the system has nowhere to go. It's beginning to implode. The whole issue of enforcement becomes all the more key. And all of a sudden, behind the smiley face of Ronald McDonald is a pretty scary caricature of cruelty, and so I was sort of looking at that, and I thought Israel would be a very good way to get at it, because for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not a superpower. I mean, it's very easy to look at the United States, for example, and trace out how the United States feeds obviously into the global military system and into the system of enforcement. But in some ways, the United States is sort of too powerful. The picture is too obvious, because the United States has the Pentagon. It has a $1 trillion a year budget. It has all these weapons. But in many ways, the United States is much more geared, the American military industry is much more geared towards conventional warfare, towards fending off major competitors like Russia at one point, China today, maybe the upcoming BRICS alliance of global South nations and so on. So the arsenal of the Pentagon is really more of an arsenal of conventional warfare. But when you're looking at enforcing capitalism, it has to go much deeper than that, because you have to be protecting and controlling sources of resources. You have to be supporting what Marx would call comprador elites. In other words, elites in what we would call third world countries today, who don't have much power themselves on a global sense, but are geopolitically in important places, like Afghanistan, for example, or who sit on important resources, and a lot of the most valuable resources in the world. Michael Clare writes about this in his books on resource wars, where he's claiming that almost all wars today are really genuinely resource wars. Those kinds of sometimes small countries and repressive countries that nevertheless sit on very valuable resources. Maybe the Congo is one of the major examples of that. Well, in that kind of a situation, in a truly global sense, where you're not just looking at the big powers, but you're looking at more detailed, more focused sources of control, American weaponry doesn't help very much. I mean, you could see it in Afghanistan and Iraq and places where the American weaponry is just, it's too big. You can't really control people. And you can't do that fine details kind of control with F-35s or nuclear missiles or a lot of the heavy armor and the heavy weaponry that the United States has. And that's where Israel comes in. To circle back in a sense, that's where Israel became very interesting for me, because Israel plays this very pivotal role. That on the one hand, it has the military sophistication to produce, high-tech weaponry systems and so on. But on the other hand, because it's been engaged in a century-long war with the Palestinians, it's really tuned its weaponry and its tactics of control and its tactics of population control and its strategies of surveillance and strategies of really of policing on a long-term basis, not coming into a war, being in a war for a year or two or three and then leaving, but having to stay for a century and with no end in sight. So being able to keep that up, to keep the control and so on, Israel has really developed those weapons of control, again, for what I call wars against the people, that the United States, Europe lacks. And I think Russia as well. I think you see in Iraq, in the Ukraine as well, that Russia is using conventional war tactics in what in many ways, is a war against the Ukrainian people. So that's where Israel becomes very useful. And then, what I find out, what I kind of ask to sort of sharpen things in my book is, how does Israel get away with it? And then as I began to kind of put the pieces together, Israel's experience with the Palestinians, Israel's the type of weaponry and tactics that Israel has produced, where does Israel fit in terms of its global reach? Because Israel, in many ways, it's hard. I'm exaggerating to some degree, but it says something that in many ways Israel has a greater global reach in terms of just not just military, but again, surveillance, population control, policing, than the United States has. The United States has something like bases in like 174 countries, according to Chalmers Johnson. And there's 193 countries in the world, so that's not a bad global reach, except the United States, again, is based on conventional warfare. So you have military bases, but the bases are fairly self-contained. You think of a military base. You have the weaponry there. You've got the barracks. You have the McDonald's on the base and so on. And then you fly out or you sail out or you move out for some operation and then you return. So you have global reach, but it's kind of shallow in a sense. And again, it's based on a certain kind of even almost a superficial engagement with another army. Israel, to tell you the truth, Israel only has two bases, both in Muslim countries, which is very interesting. One of Israel's bases is in Azerbaijan, which has really, and now, Israel is the hero country in Azerbaijan because in their war with Armenia, in which they took a good part of this region of Armenia that kind of is nestled in Azerbaijan, Armenia has used Israeli drones. Azerbaijan has become one of the major laboratories for Israeli drone development and drone warfare on the Armenians. Azerbaijan is also the place where Israel sends most of its missiles, surveillance missiles, spy missiles into space. But Azerbaijan, of course, is a jump-off place to Iran. And so in a sense, Israel is kind of a surrogate. Israel has its own interests in threatening Iran, but obviously in this bigger geopolitical situation we're in today, where you're almost at the cusp of an American-Iranian war, and where you see very clearly where Israel and Israel and the United States plan operations and carry out operations against Iranian targets. In Iran, that's where Israel does most of the work. It's inside Iran. But of course, just like we saw this week with the Iranian surrogates in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere. So that's one base. The other base is in Eritrea, which is probably, if not the most repressive, one of the most repressive countries in the world, Eritrea. And there again, it's very interesting that it's very close to the Houthis. It's close to that part of the Middle East and so on. So, but my point isn't that really. My point is that Israel has relations militarily, but again, not just militarily, in terms of training your presidential elite and your police forces. And of course, securing your local corporations and securing foreign corporations working in these countries that can be very dangerous for foreign business people. Israel has a presence there that the United States does not have. I don't think Americans have ever heard of Eritrea. I don't think Americans know where Equatorial Guinea is, which is one of the richest oil countries, and again, one of the most repressive countries in West Africa. A lot of countries that Americans have no interest in, but Israel is there. Israel, in my view, is in more than 174 countries. Israel's in countries that on the surface it's at war with or has no relationships with. And so Israel really plays a double role in the world system. On the one hand, it acts as a surrogate for the bigger power, especially for Israel is obviously aligned more with NATO than with other countries. But at the same time, we have to really understand that Israel is not merely a client of the United States or NATO in general. Israel, it turns out, is the number 2 arms supplier to China after Russia. Israel's the number 2 arms supplier to India after Russia. And not only are they supplying weaponry, it's not so much weaponry that Israel supplies to China, for example, because the United States does control to some degree, to a complete degree, the weapons, the export of weapons. But Israel's able to bypass a lot by exporting technologies, some of the technologies that have developed itself based on American technology or other technologies the Americans allow, or dual technology and so on. So Israel sends systems components or surveillance. I mean, here China and Israel are very, very strong in terms of developing this massive surveillance system that China has that it uses, for example, against the Uyghurs. So that what I'm saying is that Israel has a niche in terms of working with the bigger powers in the world, not only in controlling their own populations. The United States has a very, Israel has a very strong system of training the American police, for example. There's a big center in Atlanta at Georgia State. That's called the Galil Center. Gali Center or something. The Georgia, it's something like the Georgia Center for Legal Exchange, whatever. So in other words, it works on the military level, but deeper down in countries. So on the one hand, again, Israel works with the bigger powers in the world, but on the other, in terms of geopolitics, global geopolitics, but on the other hand, because it's got that depth in its military security relations with countries, it also works through repressive regimes in controlling their own populations. That's where Israel becomes very strong with Saudi Arabia. That's why Saudi Arabia said to Israel this week, don't worry about the Palestinians. We don't need you to commit to a two-state solution or to dealing with the Palestinian issue, wherever. No, it's okay. We, the Saudis, we want to go back to normalization. I mean, the Saudi street is seething with anger against Israel. The whole Arab world, the peoples, are seething with anger, the outrage of what Israel's doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and beyond Gaza, of course. But the governments, the governments are getting all this, not only the weaponry to protect themselves, let's say, against Iran, or for their regional geopolitics, but weaponry to control their own populations, because these are very autocratic governments. So Saudi Arabia is really saying to Israel, all we need from you is a promise that you will, at some stage begin to consider a two-state solution with the Palestinians. In other words, it's really nothing. So that's the power, in a sense. That's where Israel became more useful to trace in the global system than the United States, because of that whole issue of control. And that's really how Israel gets away with it. Because in that sense, what I'm saying is that Israel doesn't only have the support of the United States for the work it does for the United States or for NATO. I mean, now NATO's talking about a Middle East NATO, led by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. So Israel is really crucial, not only for NATO itself, but for, again, these autocratic regimes, pro-Western regimes in the region. But Israel also has, again, this niche of enforcement that allows it to work with China, to work with the BRICS countries, and to work with repressive regimes all over the world, whatever their ideological orientation is. So that's, in a sense, where Israel is. And one of the ways that it does that, just to finish up with this piece of it, is that, you have to look at the Palestinian, I write about this quite a bit, you have to look at the Palestinian occupied areas, the West Bank, and of course Gaza, as a laboratory. I mean, what country in the world has a laboratory that in which it can do anything it wants to on the Palestinians, even though it's been accused of genocide? That's not at all holding Israel back in any way. In the light of day, it doesn't care, because Israel knows it's never going to be sanctioned, because the United States has the veto in the Security Council. So it's not going to be sanctioned, and so it doesn't really care, and so it has a laboratory that it can do anything with. And with that laboratory, then, of course, as we can see in Gaza, There's all kinds of technologies that are used for the first time. I mean, this time we've got drone systems of Elbit that have been used that aren't even off the assembly line hardly, that are being used in Gaza today. You have new laser technologies. It's very useful for Israel that Hamas is throwing these missiles, and also Hezbollah in the north. I mean, they are doing, they're not doing a lot of damage. They have displaced Israelis. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it's a great thing in that sense, but it's a great thing in the laboratory sense, because Israel is now developing a laser, not only the Iron Dome system and systems of protecting, Israel from missile attacks that it's exporting everywhere, but now it's developing, and we see it now with Gaza, laser systems of intercepting missiles. And lasers have never really been, they're there, but they've never been made operational. And they're not quite operational. Israel says in another year or so. But again, you see the laboratory that they have here. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure. I don't have my watch on.
No,
How
thank
close
you.
to 20 minutes I am. But that kind of gives us an idea of where Israel would fit in.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you very much. I think, very, very interesting analysis that you have brought us here tonight. And it's so important for us to understand how Israel and the U.S. fit in together, and some of these other players as well. So really, really appreciate what you have brought up for us tonight. But I want to get into our final guest for the evening. So we're going to bring up John Spritzler. John is a retired senior research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And John's going to talk to us a little bit about how the Israeli billionaire class supports Netanyahu, as well as the Israeli far right. So, John, take it away. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jeff and Matthew, for all of your very interesting presentations. What I would like to focus on, my main point, is that there's a way to defeat Zionism, but it isn't being carried out. And I would like to talk about that. The support that Zionist ethnic cleansing has in the United States general public and the Western general public similarly is, even today, despite the mass media covering the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza, even today, a majority of the general public supports Israel. Now, there's a reason for that. The general public in the West, in the United States, has been well educated about the Holocaust and is very sympathetic to Jews and very loath to take a side that they perceive to be going against the Jews, anti-Semitic. And the main propaganda argument that Zionism uses extremely effectively is the lie that Zionist oppression and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians for all these 7+ decades has been for the purpose of making Israeli Jews be safe in a world full of anti-Semites that want to kill them and drive them into the sea and so forth. The Israeli propaganda is that, gee, we hate to have to do it. It pains us to have to do what we're doing to the Palestinians, but we have no choice. We have to do this to make our Jewish population safe. We have to have a Jewish majority population, and that requires removing most of the non-Jews from what is now Israel. That's ethnic cleansing. You can call it that if you want, but we have to do it. We're sorry. It pains us to do it, but it's for the purpose of making Jews safe. And the anti-Zionism movement, unfortunately, and this saddens me, does not challenge that Israeli lie. Instead, they simply talk about how evil and cruel and immoral the Zionist ethnic cleansing is. They never challenge the Zionist claim that its purpose is to make Israeli Jews safe. As a result, when the anti-Zionism movement asks for people to support the anti-Zionist movement, it's basically saying, well, you have a choice. You can support the Jews and what is being done by the Israeli government to make them safe, or you can support the Palestinians who are suffering terribly from what the Israeli government is doing to make Jews safe. You should take the side of the Palestinians. Well, some do. Maybe, more and more do take the side of the Palestinians, but it doesn't achieve the great majority that is required to prevent the US government from continuing to give its over-the-top support to Israel, which Israel absolutely requires to continue the Zionist ethnic cleansing project. And the reason it doesn't get that majority is that the majority of Americans and people in the West do not want to take the side that they feel is anti-Semitic in effect, because it opposes what is necessary to make Jews safe, even if they admit that it's not anti-Semitic in intent. But they will not take the side of something that they think is anti-Semitic in effect. So the anti-Zionism movement, in order to win the way the anti-apartheid in South Africa movement won, in order to get the vast majority of support that the anti-apartheid in South Africa movement got, which did in fact prevent the United States from continuing to support apartheid in South Africa. It forced the US government to do a 180 and to switch from supporting apartheid to condemning it. In order for the anti-Zionism movement to have that kind of victory, which can defeat Zionism, it has to refute what I call the Zionist big lie, that Zionist ethnic cleansing and brutal, barbaric oppression of Palestinians is for the purpose of making Jews safe. So now let me give the argument, which most people never hear. And let me point out, by the way, that when passionately pro-Israel Americans, in my personal experience, who were decent people, working class people, but passionately pro-Israel, when they hear this argument, they have done a 180. And they have ended up agreeing with me that Zionism needs to be opposed. I want you to keep that in mind. So let me make the argument. Let me first say I'm going to show that the Zionism is an attack not just on the Palestinians, which is obvious, but on the entire working class of the world, including the Jewish Israeli working class and the American working class and elsewhere. So to help you maybe understand this, I hope you'll bear with me. I'd like you to consider the effect that 9/11 had. And I'm going to talk about my personal experience and also the general world experience. In my personal experience, I'm an American. I live in Massachusetts, in Boston. In the months leading up to 2001, I was involved with other people in building a movement to stop the use of this very oppressive, high-stakes, standardized testing of school children in the public schools, designed to prevent a large proportion of working class children from graduating from high school, no matter how well they learn their lessons, in order to make them feel that they were undeserving of having a good job or even to have a job at all. This was an extremely unpopular thing, the use of these high stakes tests throughout all the states in the United States. And so myself and some others, we were building a movement against it. We had teachers on board, including many presidents of local teachers unions. We had 2 big state conventions of teachers and planning to have a job action where teachers would refuse to administer the exam. And even a statewide meeting of superintendents of public schools gave a standing ovation to my friend, who they invited to give the keynote address to the convention, who talked about why this horrible test should not be allowed to be given. So the ruling class had a big potential problem on its hands. And we were rolling along and very optimistic. We were really gaining strength and everything was great. And then 9/11 happened. And the day after 9/11, that whole movement was dead in the water, absolutely dead. 9/11 put the kibosh on it because people felt, well, we're under attack from a foreign enemy. This is no time to be, going against our government that's protecting us from these horrible Muslim terrorists. And that was the end. The same thing happened on a worldwide scale to the huge anti-globalization movement that was explicitly an anti-capitalism movement, had enormous demonstrations, getting more and more militant and larger in Seattle and Genoa and so forth. Day after 9/11, it was dead. Now, what made 9/11 kill the movement was that it had a very credible, frightening boogeyman enemy, Muslim terrorists. And how did that boogeyman enemy get created? In large measure, it got created by Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, which has been designed to be maximally oppressive, to make Palestinians maximally furious at Israel and the United States for backing Israel, to make Palestinians, carry out occasional acts of violence against the Israelis who are attacking them and impressing them, like the intifadas. That created the whole notion of the Muslim terrorist boogeyman enemy, and all the Muslims and Arabs who supported the Palestinians were included in that larger boogeyman enemy. Very credible and very effective in stopping in stopping pro-working class movements like the one I was involved in against this horrible high-stakes testing and the anti-globalization movement. So I want to make the point that the Zionist oppression of Palestinians is not only an attack on the Palestinians, who are the most obvious victims, of course. It creates the boogeyman enemy which the rulers all over the world use to attack their own working classes, like I experienced in the United States. So the question then comes up, well, what got the Zionist movement going in the first place? And the standard idea is that, oh, well, they're just ordinary Jews. They were, fleeing from oppression in Europe after the Holocaust, and so they all wanted a state of their own, where they could be safe. Well, that's just not true. First of all, the main people that made the Zionist project more than just an idea of some marginal people was the billionaire class. It was Lord Balfour, the Balfour Declaration. It was Rothschild who funded the early immigration of the Zionist movements. When it came time for the UN partition in 1948, it was Nelson Rockefeller who used his strong arm control over a lot of Latin American governments to force them to reverse their initial opposition to it and to vote in favor of it. As far as ordinary Jews go, the Zionists betrayed the ordinary Jews all during the Holocaust. The Zionists opposed any rescue effort of Jews from the Nazis that didn't entail sending the Jews to Palestine, and they never did entail sending the Jews to Palestine. The Rabbi Schoenfeld in England in the Times of London, 1961, published a long letter explaining how he and others in England had a bill that was gaining lots of support in British Parliament to make the entire British Commonwealth a haven for Jews fleeing from the Nazis. And it was about to pass. And as he explains, it did not pass. And the reason it did not pass is because the Zionist leadership in Great Britain came out and opposed the bill because it did not entail sending the Jews to Palestine, which the British could not do during the war. It was impossible. And that killed it. That killed this bill to give Commonwealth countries to make them all a safe haven for Jews during the Holocaust. There was the case of Rudolf Kastner, a top Zionist leader in Israel, who was accused by a Jewish man, a nobody, of having made a deal with the Nazis during the war in exchange for the Nazis giving him 1,600 hand-picked Jews, friends and family and so forth, that he picked who would be allowed to go to Palestine. He helped the Nazis persuade 500,000 Hungarian and Transylvanian Jews that the Nazis trains that they were putting them on were taking them just to be resettled with housing elsewhere, when in fact, as Kastner knew, they were being taken to be killed in the concentration camps. Kastner made a deal to deceive 500,000 Jews to their death to get 1,600 Jews to Palestine, intellectuals and hand-picked type people. And in his he was accused of this, and so he brought a libel charge against the accuser. And during the libel trial, it turned out that hundreds of witnesses came forward to support the accusation against him, and it became clear that his only defense was to say truthfully that he did nothing except what the whole Zionist leadership was doing at the time. And so he was conveniently assassinated by people unknown. In the displaced persons camps after World War II, they were filled with Jews. The Jews wanted to go to the United States. They didn't want to go to Palestine. But the Zionist military, Haganah, under the control of Ben-Gurion, got control of the displaced persons camps. That control was given to them by General Eisenhower. And they used that control to forcibly draft the Jews in the displaced persons camps violently, to force them to get on boats to go to Palestine to fight Arabs. So, this idea that the Zionist movement is somehow like an expression of, what ordinary Jews want is just the absolute opposite of the truth. So now that brings me to, I think, what might be the sharpest example of the anti-working class purpose of the Zionist ethnic cleansing. In 2011, in Israel, first of all, let me say that at that time and still, Israel's ruled by a billionaire ruling class, just like the United States is. The class economic inequality in Israel is extreme, something that's hardly ever reported in the Western mass media. It's extreme like it is in the United States, but even worse. the Israeli Jewish working class was suffering extremely. The rents were impossible for people to pay. The food was too expensive for people to eat. The transportation was too expensive. The wages were too low. A large proportion were just getting a minimum wage that was a poverty wage. There was extreme class anger at the ruling billionaire upper class in Israel. And as a result of that anger at their economic severe oppression, a huge wave of demonstrations erupted beginning in July of 2011. And there was demonstrations after demonstrations in cities all over Israel, week after week, getting larger and larger and larger, until after 50 days of this, with people, pitching tents on Rothschild Boulevard in the wealthy section of Tel Aviv, and doing those kind of things in cities all over, there were 450,000 Israelis, mostly Jews, the working class. Some of them call themselves middle class, but they're working class. 450,000 of them demonstrating on September 3rd against the Israeli billionaire upper class. Not only was this a huge number of people demonstrating, and it was larger than the recent ones last year over the Supreme Court conflict, but it had, according to newspaper polls, one newspaper said it had the support of 85% of the entire Jewish public. And another newspaper poll said it had the support of 90%, 90% of the Israeli public was supporting these huge demonstrations. And these were boisterous demonstrations, and with loud and enthusiastic and so forth. Now, Netanyahu was the prime minister at the time. He killed the movement. He put the kibosh on it, just like 9/11 did on the movement against the horrible school exams and the whole globalization movement. He put the kibosh on it. There was an attack, a violent attack by Palestinians on the Gaza border that killed 12 Israeli soldiers. That became the patriotic duty, as Israelis understood it, to defend their government that was supposedly protecting them against the real enemy, the Palestinians. Immediately, the next demonstration was quiet and somber. And that's when all the momentum ended and the movement died. And a few years later, Haaretz newspaper in Israel did a report on the effect of this huge demonstration. People call it the social justice demonstration, which, by the way, a year following it, an Israeli man killed himself by self-immolation, leaving a letter explaining that he did it out of anger for how he and other people like him were treated so horribly by the rich people in Israel. Jewish man, self-immolation. So Haaretz did a study. Haaretz supported these demonstrations, and it tried to put a positive spin on the usefulness and value of these demonstrations. But in doing that, in its article, it had to admit that the demonstration, which was trying to shift wealth from the rich to the working class in various means and channels, achieved absolutely zero. It won zero of its demands. This is what the boogeyman enemy of the Palestinians enabled the ruling class of Israel to do, to kill what would otherwise have been an unstoppable, huge pro-working class movement against the power of the billionaire class. And the only way that they can keep that boogeyman enemy, which, by the way, let me point out that you know, in the United States, we only had 9/11 on one time, but in Israel, there's like 9/11s all the time. Every time that there's any kind of a rising up by Palestinians against the Israeli army, an intifada or anything even minor, it's another 9/11. It's another way that the Israeli billionaire class persuades the Israelis not to seriously try to challenge the power of that billionaire class, because they would be going against their so-called protectors, against the real enemy. So the purpose of the ethnic cleansing and the horrible occupation and the brutal barbaric occupation and the home demolitions of Palestinians inside Israel and all that cruelty, the purpose of it is to maximize the anger. And at this point, I need to also add that the Israeli government for decades has been funding and working to keep Hamas in power, funding it and working to keep it in power, precisely because Hamas is overtly terrorist, overtly aiming to make Islam sovereign in all of Palestine, which is what its covenant says, and it's never been revoked. And it overtly uses violence to kill ordinary non-combatant Israeli civilians, starting with the suicide bombings and then the rockets aimed at civilians in towns in Israel, and then October 7th, of course. This is why the Israeli government has funded Hamas and worked to keep it in power. And it needed Hamas because the PLO was not sufficiently frightening at all. The PLO initially, its aim was to make all of Palestine a single, secular, democratic state in which Jews and non-Jews would be equal under the law. Well, that's not exactly frightening to working class Jews, many of whom would probably say that sounds like a good idea. Hamas, on the other hand, making all Jews second-class citizens by making Islam sovereign throughout all of Palestine, killing Israeli Jews just because they're Israeli Jews, you know, that makes the Palestine boogeyman enemy maximally frightening. And that's exactly what the Israeli government needs, and that's why it's been funding and working to keep Hamas in power. And when I say keep Hamas in power, I mean everybody knows that in the past, the bombings of Gaza increased the support for Hamas among people in Gaza. That's undeniable. So I just need to conclude by saying that if the Zionists in Israel stopped treating the Palestinians like dirt, if it granted their right of return, if it gave them equal rights under the law with Jews in all of Palestine, if it returned the stolen property and so forth, there would be peace. Palestinians would completely reject terrorists like Hamas. They only support them to the extent that Hamas claims to be truly doing something against the Israeli oppressors. There would be peace. But with that peace, with the absence of a boogeyman enemy, the Israeli billionaires would be one step away from being overthrown by the kind of mass movement that developed in Israel in 2011, but which, if there was peace, would not be killed, but would continue until it won what it was after, which is economic equality and an end to the inequality that makes billionaires billionaires. Now, the last thing I want to say is that all of the governments of the world are run by oppressor ruling classes, and they all support the two-state solution. The only exception, I suppose, is Netanyahu, and he has no solution at all. So the prime ministers before him, Ehud Olmert, supported the two-state solution. And the reason is that the two-state solution says to the Palestinians, okay, you get a little postage stamp sized area of land, you know, we'll call it a state. You can fly the Palestinian flag, you can be a member of the UN, but you must forfeit forever your right of return to the 78% of Palestine from which you were driven out by violent ethnic cleansing. That's a totally immoral plan, and it does not end the number one grievance of Palestinians, which is to be able to return, to have their right of return honored, to return back to where they were driven out of from inside Israel. And so the two-state solution will maintain the anger of the Palestinians, and thus it will maintain the existence of a frightening boogeyman enemy that will be used not just by the Israeli ruling class, but by ruling classes all over as a way of frightening their own working classes into obedience instead of rising up against their own ruling class that pretends to be protecting them from Muslim terrorists. So I just want to point out that the article that I wrote that says what I just said now, when I joined Jewish Voice for Peace, which is one of the main anti-Zionist organizations in the United States, and I simply told people about that article and asked them to read it, the local and the national leadership of Jewish Voice for Peace expelled me, said that my views are racist against Palestinians because I'm expressing some sympathy for the Jewish working class. They expelled me. And we have a big problem. You know, I said, Houston, we got a problem. And that's that the anti-Zionist movement is not explaining to the general public that supporting Zionism is attacking ordinary Israeli Jews. Opposing Zionism is taking the side of ordinary Israeli Jews. If we did that in a big way, we would be able to do what the movement against South African apartheid did, which is win the vast majority of the American public to our side and force the US government to have to do a 180 and stop supporting Israel. And that would put the kibosh on Israeli Zionism. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, John. Really appreciate what you brought to us here tonight. So I do want to say we have gone a little late. I think there were some really interesting questions, but there will be more of these webinars. We will have more of these. We'll have more opportunities for folks to come together. I do want to thank our three guests tonight, Matthew Ho, Jeff Halper, and John Spritzler. Really appreciate all of you taking the time to be on this, to share your insights, your experiences, and everything you have with us. We really appreciate everything that you have done in terms of, this webinar tonight. If you're still watching, we are going to have to end, but I do want to ask folks, if you are watching and if you appreciated this webinar, please go to covertactionmagazine.com/donate and help us out so we can put on more of these events. We can continue publishing our website every weekday, 5 days a week, and continue to bring more. So again, thank you everyone. This will be available on YouTube and linked from our website so you can share it with others when the recording is over. Have a great evening.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.